Ladies and gentlemen, dear students, dear colleagues, milí Michale. On the 13th of September 1968, the West German Socialist Student Union held a delegates conference in Frankfurt am Main. Helke Sander was the only officially scheduled female speaker. She addressed the gap between the attention the Students' Union was paying to global political issues and its complete ignorance of practical problems that women were facing in their professional, activist, and private lives. She called for the kindergarten as a powerful symbol of their hoped-for freedom. Hans-Jürgen Krahl, the conference chairman and charismatic theorist of the 68 student movement, did not respond to any of the issues. He merely proceeded to the next item on the agenda. And at that point, the heavily pregnant Sigrid Dam-Rüger started throwing tomatoes at him from the audience. Why do I talk about 68 and Germany? It's because it might remind us of very interesting chronology of gaining women's rights and also about fighting for them, about going for conflict in favor of women's rights. The famous Tomatenwurf in Frankfurt, in fact, was a symbolic launch of the new feminist movement that Germany needed and had a long way to go. But it was also a it was also to remind us of that you can actually completely lose certain issues from the agenda. The student movement was supposed to emancipate women, and then suddenly you saw the board dominated by men and all the women's issues actually being lost from the agenda. By that point, their female counterparts in communist dictatorships seemed to have achieved most of what West German women demanded. It is difficult to see that from inside a socialist country, but a number of policies of the Stalinist period of Czechoslovak socialism, and I'll take that example today, had far-reaching consequences on women's formal status and quite some consequences on changing social practice. Czech and Slovak women enjoyed full legal equality with men, as well as an equal access to the education and many professions, while West German women still had to ask their husbands for a permission to be employed or to travel abroad. Czech sociologist Alena Wagnerová, who married a German and moved to West Germany in the early 1970s, described it as follows. She said, "It was a journey to the past. My everyday life turned into a permanent confrontation with the traditional pattern, its imagery, requirements, and expectations." And inspired by that experience, she wrote a book back in the 70s, which was called Die Frau im Sozialismus, Beispiel ČSSR. And that's the second reason why I want to talk about it, because we can see what is at stake when either moving between countries and orders and when moving between eras. What Wagnerová described in the book and what we know about the Czechoslovak model of emancipation, the socialist emancipation model, was a contradictory one. And I would like to first briefly summarize these contradictions to see what was in fact at stake in 1989. Within the Act on Family Law, adopted as early as in 1949, Czechoslovak women gained full legal equality with men. The Act abandoned the legal institution of head of household, and spouses also became equal in relation to their children and all acquired property. Divorce laws and the right to abortion were liberalized through consequent legislation, once again by mid-1950s. These changes represented a fulfillment of earlier feminist demands and proposals, and yet the existing women's movement and its flourishing and pluralist activist scene were destroyed. Milada Horáková is a painfully literal embodiment of that, because while her draft of the family law was in fact adopted by Parliament with lots of celebration, she was in prison, interrogated, and later stood for court and was sentenced to death in one of the most notorious show trials of Czechoslovak Stalinism. The new legislation, however, was presented as supposedly expressing a new revolutionary ideology which saw family as an outdated bourgeois institution. People were supposed to dominantly realize their potential in public sphere, while family as a private sanctuary was to be superseded by professional cooking and collective childcare in public facilities. This never happened in the extent hoped for by the ideology, but women were encouraged to take full-time jobs and become self-confident part of labor force, including the occupations traditionally regarded as masculine. Women and men were supposed to be equal in building socialism. In the 60s, and that's a very interesting chapter, experts were brought in to assist in formulating new post-Stalinist gender and family policy, which would give up the earlier idea of the sameness of men and women and also help with the falling birth rates. Economists started to challenge the efficiency of female employment. It was found unprofitable because the costs of collective childcare facilities were counted in the expenses on the employment of women. Psychologists used the child deprivation theory when referring to mothers' full-time jobs and kindergartens and nurseries. So it remains a major paradox that the politically liberalizing reform project of the Prague Spring in 1968 involved an open attack on women's employment. The following period of 1969 to 1989 represented yet another transformation. The new policy of less politically mobilized citizenship involved a new legitimacy or even desirability of an escape to nuclear family. The strategy was accompanied by far-reaching pro-population policies, including the repeated extension of maternity benefit and leave, already by then the longest in Europe, newlywed loans, child-raising supplements, and others. This era saw men and women as equal but substantially different. Women were shown less so in their professional environments and positions, much more often as mothers, and that worked even for openly political contexts. This is in fact a propaganda photo from the general elections in 1986. And here you see 4 women either organizing, assisting, or taking part in elections. However, these changes were not followed by any dramatic retreat in women's formal social status. The proportion of females in total labor force rose throughout the 60s to 46.7% of the total labor force in 70 to never fall any substantially again. The private sphere also involved some crucial contradictions. On the one hand, no far-reaching redistribution of work within the household and childcare took place. That is usually referred to as the double burden that women in socialist countries had to bear, or the second shift that women had to take after a full-time job, doing all the childcare and housework. And yet they were highly powerful and independent. Ivan Vodochodsky, who did research of men under socialism, talked about, quote, men living in their wives' households. So the communist dictatorship did create strong, emancipated, and confident women. The last question of political representation and real political empowerment is a fascinating one. Parliamentary assemblies at national level offered a stable and very impressive quantitative representation. In 1969, let's say that's the focal point, West German women only formed 6% of the Bundestag, while there were 26% of women in the Czechoslovak Federal Assembly, reaching 29% in 1973 to 1986. This was reached through a system of quotas adopted for each category relevant for the communist doctrine. So there were not only women counted and sort of established in parliaments and the national committees, but also industrial workers, peasants, Communist Party members, ethnic minorities, and others. Such system enabled the physical presence of women and other overall quite uncommon categories of people in parliament and some other institutions. Of course, being sort of put in parliament only purely on gender basis without much political experience, as is probably the case of this lady, did not have much political effect and did not mean that women's agendas would in fact be represented. And also, when it comes to more executive institutions, the picture is strikingly different. The Czechoslovak national and federal government used to have a single female minister with typical social, education or healthcare agenda, or no woman at all. The Communist Party Central Committee had 8 women out of 115 members in the same period, and 1 out of 20 in the Central Committee Presidium, none in the Politburo. The more powerful the body, the fewer the women. In my research, I talked about powerless visibility in that period, but the surprise is that it will turn into unquestioned invisibility. Among the first issues that the Velvet Revolution in 1989 challenged in Czechoslovakia and swept away was what had been referred to as artificial representation of social groups in political institutions. Working class people and women virtually instantly disappeared from parliamentary seats. As early as in January 1990, when half of the members of the federal parliament were dismissed and replaced through so-called co-opting, there were less than 4% women among the new deputies who would supposedly, quote, offer better guarantees for the development of political democracy. The first free elections in June 1990, as we can see in the slide, brought just around 10% of women to the crucial legislature that was set to address essential political, economic, and social reforms in the coming years. Within the new gender discourse, the previous emancipation, which we saw as widely endorsed by women, was now labeled as forced, as emancipation from above, and it reached into many spheres of public and private lives. There are thousands of absolutely unbelievable quotes that I could bring here. I'll take just one by a member of parliament, a woman, a medical doctor, Klára Sarkozy, who ran for the Hungarian Christian Democratic Movement and gained a seat in the federal parliament in Prague. And she described it as follows: I did not feel as a minority in the Federal Assembly, even though there were fewer women than ever. I believe nobody should become a deputy just because of being a woman. Nobody should get any benefits on such grounds. Within the same logic, introducing commercialized sexuality and unregulated sexual industry, the first target of Western feminism at that time, was understood as a part of democratic package. Now, excuse me, that'll be 2 shocking photos, but necessary. This is an official photo which was run by the Czechoslovak press agency in early 1990 to celebrate the printing of the first Czech pornographic magazine called Leo. And there are these half-naked hostesses assisting the printers. And this is a cultural review, Tvorba, very long existing and high-profile cultural review, which ran a photo report from the Miss Monokini contest and accompanied it with Vladimír Holan's poem. However, the discourse was interacting with tangible legal and executive shifts. The scenario for economic reform, Scénář ekonomické reformy, a government document adopted by the Federal Parliament in September 1990, stated the following: to reduce imbalances in the labor market, the state economic policy shall regulate the labor force supply. it will be limited by a new regulation of the parental allowance, resulting in lower employment of mothers, providing more part-time jobs for women and economic incentives for persons in post-productive age to diminish the extent of work. Once again, reducing the employment of women with little children and old age pensioners was an explicit objective of the government policy also mentioned in the so-called scenario for social reform. Both documents also criticized the state socialist policy for impetuously achieving, quote, the highest employment rate of women in Europe. Such conscious government policy trying to push certain categories of citizens, namely mothers of little children and the elderly, from the labor market, had later been confirmed by a number of experts. For example, Petr Víšek, who worked at the Ministry of Social Affairs and designed its policy for almost 2 decades, recollected later that the social legislation of 1990 had 2 objectives. First, to enable parents to take care of and educate their children at home, and second, to, quote, withdraw approximately 300,000 people from the labor market, above all mothers of little children, who would be extremely vulnerable to unemployment. He added, the World Bank recommended so, and continued, the sense of the regulation was to offer an alternative option to not having a job. The parental allowance mentioned in the scenario was not a completely new social benefit. As I said, Czechoslovakia had the longest maternity leave and also a maternal allowance since 1970. The new regulation of 1990 offered social support regardless of the parent's gender and number of children, and provided 3 years, 4 years as of 1995, of an allowance. But under one condition, under the condition that you did not earn above a very low cap and your child was not placed in a public childcare facility. The government therefore explicitly gave up the pro-natality aims of the previous governments and instead suggested that the state supports you in case of full-time parenthood once you keep off the labor market. The kindergartens and nursery schools were the next target of policymakers. Once again, lots of wonderful quotes. I'll just quote Boleslav Barta, a psychologist and member of parliament for the Moravian autonomous movement, who claimed that for a child, quote, even mediocre family care was better than excellent education in a collective institution. Even the federal prime minister, Marian Čalfa, a Slovak communist who served in late socialist governments as well, suddenly sort of recollected that children under 3 years of age do not belong into the institutional care anyway. As a result of that, after the 1990s, there were only 3% of nursery schools of the 1980s left, and only 60% of the previous places for preschool children. Most mothers did not return to work after the maternity leave, but spent several years on the parental benefit. Now, if you imagine the deep economic restructuring, even if all these women actually wanted to go back to work, because it was never reported or observed that women would actually want to become housewives, they still couldn't do that because their jobs simply did not exist. And we can observe that even for much, much shorter breaks. Rather than concluding that women sort of consciously left the labor market and wanted to, as some conservative comments said, happily become housewives, you can observe a differentiation of family patterns, including completely new ones, such as the green widows, women segregated in these new luxury suburbs. There was a vast differentiation of reproductive behavior and also of strategies toward the labor market. Nonetheless, we have to confirm that many actors, including those with strong historical legitimacy, such as prominent emigrants or members of the opposition, including female members of the opposition, joined in an attack at emancipation and female employment. Now, is this a story of disillusionment? Well, not exactly, because nobody, commented on it as a hope that was not met. Let me once again quote Alena Wagnerová, who criticized Germany for its backward gender order in the 70s. In the early 1990s, she made the following comment about Czechoslovakia, quote, "The speed at which, after the Velvet Revolution, men rediscovered their hunting ground in entrepreneurship, business, and other free professions that had been lost 40 years ago, allows us to establish the degree of humiliation they experienced under socialism." She regretted that Czech women did not want to hear about women's movement and feminism then. Quote, "Czech women do not know yet how quickly their rights could be lost." And that's probably where I am heading, and what the disillusionment of at least us as intellectuals should be. Consciously leaving the socialist period behind, what most Czech and Slovak women actually did, meant that they perceived their equality as natural given, as something perfectly commonplace, which they did not have to contest for in a manner their German counterparts had to. There were many arenas where the equality proved to be something to be lost easily, and in my opinion, where they proved to be something, at least in the longer run, worth reflection or even a conflict. So I'm sharing my own disillusionment here, which is maybe this is not only women's rights, maybe it's other rights, maybe it's other parts of the systems that, if we don't know about their existence, don't know about them being worth a reflection and conflict, might be lost again. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Adéla, for brilliant talk. I do appreciate especially 2 points. First of all, that you've brought this point of disillusionment into the arena when we were discussing with Jerome Erto, etc. I just realized this is a central issue that is being omitted, or that is being. It was almost missing, let's say, in November 1 month ago when commemorating November 1989. And it's very pity. I'm very glad that precisely here we can open this issue. And the second point I would like to appreciate very much regards these contradictions that you see not only states or socialism, but also the changes after 1989, not as a, let's say, black and white, but with all the contradictions that it has. So thank you once more for very inspiring and brilliant talk. So I would have one question. I mean, what can you see as the major points, events, or personalities that shifted? I mean, these the awareness of the women's rights, let's say, in the second half of the 20th century. For instance, you've mentioned, and I find it to be extremely important, that this family law 1949 had actually non-communist origin with Milada Horáková, who was, left-wing but non-communist, etc. What were the most important motifs, events that somehow shifted in the second half of the 20th century from your perspective?
Well, that's a very good question, because the answer is, unfortunately, well, there were not many. You know, the emancipation was as if reached very early, so we simply did not have any second wave feminism in Czechoslovakia. And there was only a very slow and varied way of feminist consciousness to reappear in the 1990s. So I would say, interestingly enough, women had gained everything that Western women actually fought for a long time, and then they sort of lost everything because nobody would, consciously accept feminism as a legitimate ideology in the 1990s. It was really thrown away together with communism and socialism, and there were serious attacks. When I said, I spoke about people with strong historical legitimacy, you know, there were several exiles, Czech exiles returning back to the country and telling us about the horror of political correctness out there in the West, and most people actually listened to them, and you know, the whole debate about sexual harassment and political correctness was really blocked for several years. So Western observers, when they came here in the 1990s, could not believe that such a backward, conservative, anti-feminist and anti-feminine discourse could exist anywhere at the end of the 20th century.
I have a comment which leads me to a question. You quoted or referred to Adéla Gjuričová, but she also actually was analyzing this change in the 1990s through the reference of restructuring of property, capitalist restructuring of property, which was not only between private and public sphere, but also along the gendered lines. So there was, we can see the economic foundations underlying these gender changes and the shift towards more conservative gendered order. So I really liked your, the point that we need to see the rights as something which is a result of previous social struggles, and we need to remind these that if we take them as for granted, they can be easily lost. But what is then? How would you see this relations between the economic order, the capitalist economic order established here since the 90s, and then this message of rights as necessarily being fought for?
Thank you. That's a very complex question, because in fact the whole feminist movement, also as an intellectual movement, is reflecting on it. Has actually capitalism sort of emptied feminism, because feminism was founded, and the 68ers in Germany definitely thought that it's a collective social movement, and now we have also feminisms that actually completely individualize it and celebrate these female business women and all that. So that's one sort of pole of the debate. Has feminism to be collectivist or can it be individualist? But the second and practical, and that's where I think Zuzana is heading, is really this profound change in Czechoslovakia, later Czech and Slovak republics in the 1990s. And there I would say it was definitely, and I was trying to argue that, since the very beginning, this scenario was passed just not even a year after the Velvet Revolution, and the whole privatization project, the whole economic restructuring actually ran along it, and we did not notice that there was such an attack at female employment included. We really did not see it then, or at least I did not, and I was an adult woman already. So somehow there were some unnoticed elements, and then this deep economic restructuring was simply not advantageous for most women. Let us just imagine all these women who left the labor market for 3 or even 4 years in the 1990s. Once again, no jobs existed, no jobs waited for you, not even professions, expertises waited for you for 3 or 4 years. And Wagnerova, talked in a very sort of poetic way about the hunting grounds that men reinvented in free entrepreneurship or whatever, but that's a very elegant way to say so.
I have one question connected with our conference in Paris, because in Paris we saw the film about the women of solidarity, Kobiety Solidarności, and the role of a very big role of women in the solidarity movement in Poland. And we saw in this film that after '89, this big role was completely reduced or even erased from the collective memory in Poland. And I have the question, is in the Czech Republic it was the same situation maybe? The role of the women of the 89th in the collective memory.
I would say the Polish women had already made the film, you know. They have actually made an issue out of it. Let me just say two, or try to describe two pictures. One is a press conference of the Civic Forum at the turn of November, December 1989. So, you know, Velvet Revolution is going, you have a press conference of the new revolutionary movement and their leaders, and there are, in the photographs, there are 5 men and 1 woman. The 5 men are Václav Havel, Václav Malý, an actor, you know, so on, and the woman is an interpreter who is translating it into English. So it is an immediate hierarchization, you know, of the leadership which took place here. It was just a few days after communism started to fall apart. And the second example which I wanted to make was a very recent book made by, you know, gender studies oriented sociologist and called Bytová revolta, the apartment revolt, which was in fact a set of interviews of female dissidents made. And these, you know, gender conscious sociologists actually asked those women who were members of opposition, so how did you feel? So how was it? Did you feel like oppressed? Did you feel this was patriarchal, whatever? And all the respondents, women, you know, who went through prisons or unemployment, I mean forced unemployment under communism and all that, said, no, not really, no, it was fine. You know, we felt this solidarity between men and women because our real enemy was communism and the police. So we're still not there, probably. And that's exactly why I'm opening the issue.
Hello, and thank you for your presentation. My question is regarding something that was somewhat puzzling to me. Going back to the provocative photo of the women celebrating topless the release of pornography in pornographic magazines in the Czech Republic, why was that seen as like a gain in the women's movement? To me personally, it seems sort of like contrary to their goals of being respected and seen personally as opposed to, you know, kept away and only seen like sexually. So
very difficult to explain. You know, I tried to do that in my research and I'm still not sure about the conclusion. But the only explanation I can have, why did, you know, we saw the photo of the celebration of printing the first pornographic magazine. The number of issues of that magazine sold before Christmas 1990 was 480,000 copies. That's like huge in the Czech printing market, you know. So it means like almost all families, which means that almost all families actually found a pornographic magazine under the Christmas tree in 1990. You know, did you? Why do you do that? My explanation is because we believed into a democratic package. And that was why you stopped regulating not only prostitution, but even, you know, construction development. You believed in not regulating parking in central Prague. You believed into that freedom and market would somehow sort it all. And therefore, once again, Western observers said, we couldn't believe there were women carrying these plastic bags with shopping, and they had naked women on the plastic bags because those were Western bags. So somehow there was a big Western package which we could not distinguish from a consumer exploiting package.
Good afternoon, thank you for your presentation. And the question is, like, were there some attempts to change the situation regarding to the unemployment rate of women during the period of 1991-1995? Because I can't believe that the government didn't know about this problem and didn't want to change something. So were there some attempts?
No, the gap in male and female unemployment was not as big as it would seem. I mean, this graph shows that it was created, but that was exactly what they tried to avoid. They tried to have almost all working class women unemployed, which would be the result. And therefore, they made up this replacement of very long home childcare. And you know, it then made the return to the original job more difficult. But there's also a wonderful book, Elaine Weiner, an American scholar. She interviewed Czech, I think, not only, I think only Czech working class women, and they were completely committed to that. You know, they have to find a way how to survive on the labor market and not ask the government for anything. They reported feeling like beggars when going to get the unemployment benefits and so on. And of course, these were all working class women in the regions who, you know, 100% or 150% suffered from the structural unemployment, which we weren't aware of in Prague with all the service industry and so on.